Pope Leo XIV has publicly denounced the brutal massacre in Benue State, Nigeria, a harrowing slaughter of nearly 200 internally displaced civilians in Yelwata. Speaking before the Sunday Angelus on June 15, he described the atrocity as a terrible massacre, invoked divine comfort for victims, and issued a fervent prayer for security, justice, and peace. As outrage swells from Lagos to Rome, we unpack the story behind the headlines, with faith at the heart of our commentary. On the night of June 13 into the early hours of June 14, a horrific assault shattered the fragile peace in Yelwata, a farming community in Gumar local government area, nestled on the border between Benue and Nasarawa states in central Nigeria. What began as a place of refuge, home to internally displaced Christian families sheltered by a local Catholic mission, became the scene of an unspeakable tragedy. Around 10 p.m. on June 13, more than 40 heavily armed assailants, suspected Fulani herdsmen or jihadist militants, arrived on motorcycles, encircling Yelwata from multiple directions. Witnesses described the attackers shouting Allahu Akbar as they moved house to house, firing indiscriminately, setting buildings ablaze, and slaughtering their victims with extreme brutality. The parish priest, Father Ukuma Jonathan Angbianbi, recounted how homes housing more than 500 displaced people, many sleeping under the mission's roof, were engulfed in flames, with doors doused in fuel before being set alight. Survivors spoke of fleeing into the night, only to be hunted, hacked, and shot, some even thrown back into burning structures. By sunrise, the village lay in smoldering ruin. At least 150 bodies were recovered early on. By the following days, that toll rose to approximately 200 confirmed dead, many burned beyond recognition as scenes of unimaginable horror unfolded across Yelwata's farmlands and mission grounds. Among the victims were women, children, the elderly, and hundreds who had fled prior attacks and believed they were safe under the church's care. Survivors remained traumatized, lacked even the most basic needs, food, shelter, medicine, and now face the shadow of disease amid cholera and typhoid risks. Father Remigius Ihula of the Justice and Peace Commission warned this atrocity was not random, it was part of a broader campaign aimed at forcibly displacing Christians from ancestral homelands. The local Catholic mission, meant to offer sanctuary, instead became ground zero of terror. This was a disaster of calculated cruelty, a community's final refuge turned into a charnel ground, with the church itself bearing witness to suffering it could not avert. Number 2. Papal response. In his solemn Angelus address on Sunday, June 15, Pope Leo XIV offered a moving, faith-driven response to the horror that unfolded in Benue State. He labeled the Yelwata onslaught a terrible massacre, emphasizing that around 200 people, mostly internally displaced Christians under the protection of a local Catholic mission, were slaughtered with extreme cruelty. In doing so, the Pope didn't merely recount a tragedy, he gave it moral and spiritual weight. By naming the victims and their persecutors, he imbued the violence with gravity that transcends statistics. But Leo XIV didn't stop at condemnation. He offered a bold prayer, not for silence, but for action. Speaking from St. Peter's Square, he prayed that security, justice, and peace will prevail in Nigeria, a beloved country so affected by various forms of violence, and made a heartfelt plea in a special way for the rural Christian communities in Benue State, who have been unceasingly the victims of violence. His words remind us that his role extends beyond spiritual leadership, it is prophetic. In those simple phrases, he called on God and on global conscience to ensure safety and accountability for the vulnerable. In tone, the Pope struck a balance, grief-laden yet resolute, prayerful yet purposeful. He placed the massacre alongside other global crises, from Sudan and Myanmar to Ukraine and the Middle East, making the Benue tragedy part of a broader tapestry of human suffering, without diluting its specificity. It was a moment of universal empathy and intercession. For first-time listeners, here's what matters. Pope Leo XIV's words are more than pastoral comfort, they are a spiritual rebuke to impunity. His tete-a-tete with the world framed this massacre not as another chapter in the news cycle, but as a moral rupture. The call for security, justice, and peace stands as both prayer and decree, from the Vatican, to Nigeria, to every listener with faith and conscience. Number 3. Context of ongoing violence. Over the past several months, Benue's tragedies have not been isolated incidents, but part of a grim and mounting pattern. In April 2025, multiple attacks across 4 villages, Tiolaha, Tseubium, Ahum, and Ayondona, saw at least 42 people killed in a wave of herder-farmer violence. Then in late May, gunmen, believed to be herders, massacred at least 20 civilians in Ayondona, Gwere West, igniting fresh outrage. Just weeks later, the slaughter in Yelwata claimed between 100 and 200 lives, a brazen escalation of cruelty targeting displaced Christians, reportedly sheltered by a Catholic mission. Amnesty International deplored the almost daily bloodshed and labeled this relentless violence a crisis of profound proportions. These losses aren't just statistics, they fuel mounting frustration and despair. In Makurdi, Benue's capital, thousands of youths, dressed in grief and anger, blocked roads and roundabouts, demanding government intervention. They held up banners declaring "Stop Benue killings" and insisted, "We have had enough," confronting local officials and enduring tear gas to make their voices heard. The protests condemned not only the attackers but the policy failures they say allowed it to continue unchecked. They accuse both state and federal leaders, including Governor Alia and President Tinubu, of failing to protect citizens, and warn that the tide of crisis could overflow if ignored. At the same time, analysts emphasize that this violence is rooted in deep, overlapping crises, land and water competition intensified by climate change, ineffective open grazing laws, and an influx of armed herders, some tied to jihadist elements. The result, Benue, Nigeria's traditional food basket, is bleeding. Farmers cannot plant, communities cannot rebuild. Today's massacre in Yelwata is not a break in the cycle, but its cruelest chapter. Without decisive action, security reforms, justice for victims, and real enforcement of grazing restrictions, Benue remains trapped in a spiral. And the people are demanding the world listen. 4. Local and federal security reactions. In the immediate aftermath of the Yelwata massacre, local authorities in Guma local government area confirmed at least 59 deaths and a staggering 3,000 displaced, many of whom were women, children, pregnant and elderly residents residing in mission shelters. The National Emergency Management Agency described a dire humanitarian situation unfolding around these internally displaced persons. President Bola Tinubu, visibly shaken by the atrocity, declared enough is enough and mobilized Nigeria's top security apparatus to respond. He issued a direct order to the Chief of Defense Staff, the Inspector General of Police, and intelligence chiefs to launch a full-scale security operation in Benue State. Within hours, elite units from the military, police, and national intelligence agencies were deployed on the ground, establishing security command posts across Guma. CDS General Christopher Musa and Inspector General of Police Kaodig Betakan led delegation teams that visited Yelwata firsthand, pledging an aggressive pursuit of perpetrators and urging civilians to support with intelligence. President Tinubu also announced he would adjust his schedule to personally visit Benue, originally planned for Kaduna State, to meet with survivors, community elders, and youth leaders in a town hall aiming to foster reconciliation and restore calm. He summoned Governor Hyacinth Alia to facilitate dialogue among farmers and herders and to rein in incendiary rhetoric, yet despite the high-level interventions, trust in security forces remains fragile. Local protesters, many masked in grief, took to Makurdi's roads, accusing authorities of failure and spoke of betrayal. Some confrontations led to tear gassing, underscoring the urgency of restoring confidence. Critics argue the response, while swift, is reactive and that Nigeria's broader security architecture remains ill-equipped to prevent such carnage. Calls are rising for structural reform, including the creation of state police and better enforced grazing laws, to address the root drivers of violence. In this volatile junction, the question isn't just who will be apprehended, but can Nigeria's security system be rebuilt on trust and deterrence? The local and federal governments have responded, but whether this moment marks a turning point or a temporary reprieve remains to be seen. 5. Global solidarity and national voices. Beyond the Vatican, voices around the world and within Nigeria have risen in unified condemnation of this massacre. Amnesty International Nigeria described the Yelwata assault as horrifying, calling for an immediate end to the almost daily bloodshed in Benue and the swift prosecution of perpetrators. They emphasized families were locked up and burnt inside their bedrooms, with bodies burned beyond recognition. Former Vice President and presidential hopeful, Atiku Abubakar, joined the outcry, branding the events a national tragedy. In a forceful statement titled "Stop Turning a Blind Eye," he urged President Tinubu and Governor Alia to launch a transparent, full-scale investigation. He warned that silencing protests and firing tear gas at mourners only deepens public mistrust. Unleashing force on grieving, defenseless citizens is not governance. It is cruelty, he declared. Popular musician and activist Tu Baba also weighed in, demanding urgent action from the government. "We cannot watch our families die in silence," he declared on social media, adding momentum to the groundswell of outrage. These calls have spurred nationwide protests. In Makurdi, thousands of youths, many visibly bereaved, blocked key roads, carrying placards reading "Stop Benue Killings" and chanting demands for justice. Some faced tear gas as police attempted to disperse them. Their message is clear: this violence cannot be ignored. Criminal justice experts and civil society activists have highlighted that this moment reflects a crisis of accountability. Amnesty points to a pattern of unchecked impunity. Atiku warns of leadership indifference. Tu Baba channels public anguish. And the protesters on Benue streets are the conscience of a nation demanding its leaders honor their sacred duty to protect lives, not silence suffering. In this global outpouring of solidarity, from human rights groups to pop icons to street-level vigils, the demand is unequivocal: justice must come, and it must start now. 6. Faith-driven perspective. From the very heart of Catholic tradition flows a powerful model we can call prayer pressure, a papal posture that weaves spiritual intercession with moral clout in moments of human crisis. Over centuries, popes have invoked this dual instrument of prayer and moral authority to confront conflict, urge accountability, and press for change, without drawing a sword. Consider Pope Pius XII's 1948 encyclical Auspicia Quidem, where he rallied the global faithful to a prayer crusade for peace in Palestine, calling on the world to unite in spiritual solidarity for justice in a war-torn land. His words weren't passive, they were a clarion for collective conscience rooted in the Gospel's demand for peace. Fast forward to the Cold War era, Pope John XXIII, with Pacem in Terris, opened channels of dialogue between the US and the Soviet Union. Placing the moral weight of the Vatican behind international diplomacy and helping thaw one of modern history's most dangerous standoffs, this spiritual diplomatic legacy extends through the decades. In the 1970s, as war threatened Chile and Argentina over the Beagle Channel, Pope John Paul II sent an envoy to mediate, halting a potential conflict and reinforcing the Church's role as compassionate peacemaker. His successors echoed this approach: PPA's involvement in Colombia's peace process, Pope Francis's spiritual retreats with South Sudanese leaders, and his prayerful diplomacy in Ukraine and the Middle East, all exemplify this faithful insistence on peace as both prayer and action. This is not simple charity, it is strategic moral leverage. When Pope Leo XIV condemned the Yelwata massacre, he didn't retreat behind scripture, he stepped onto the global stage and insisted the world act. His invocation, calling for security, justice, and peace, is the next step of that centuries-old papal playbook, where the Holy Father's voice becomes a summons: pray hard, and don't settle until justice prevails. For believers and observers alike, understanding this papal faith-driven stance unlocks the deeper significance of his words, not simply emotion, but inspiration for moral urgency. It's a spiritual command born of doctrine, and carried by the weight of historic precedent. 7. Historical parallel in church history. Through centuries, the papacy has woven a tapestry of moral intervention, linking the massacre in Benue with a long tradition of Vatican responses to atrocity, conflict, and injustice. Today, Pope Leo XIV's condemnation echoes a lineage of popes who wielded spiritual and diplomatic influence to confront human suffering. In the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide, Pope Francis issued a solemn apology for the Church's failures, acknowledging that priests and religious succumbed to hatred and violence during the slaughter of some 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus in 1994. His meeting with Rwandan President Kagame marked what the Vatican called a new chapter in healing and accountability. Going further back, under Pope Benedict XV during World War I, the Vatican mediated prisoner-of-war exchanges, secured protections for civilians, and gave voice to the suffering in occupied regions, even appealing to Sultan Mehmed V to temper the persecution of Armenian Christians in 1915. And under Pius XII during the Holocaust, Vatican diplomats, like Angelo Roncalli in Turkey and Hungary, sheltered thousands of Jews, issuing baptismal documents, safe haven, and moral counsel amid Nazi brutality. Pope John Paul II, too, intervened in global conflict. He used encyclicals and diplomatic outreach to condemn war, calling the 1991 Gulf War darkness menacing the earth, opposing both the Gulf and Iraq wars, and championing peace through UN mechanisms, even sending envoys to engage US leadership. His 2001 diplomatic visit to Syria helped shepherd the TAIF agreement that ended Lebanon's civil war, demonstrating how papal influence can shape geopolitical reconciliation. In recent years, the Vatican has persisted. Pope Francis's 2019 document on human fraternity, Abu Dhabi, and encyclical Fratelli Tutti urged interreligious solidarity and early intervention against bloodshed. And Pope Leo XIV himself has already called for responsibility and reason amid Middle East tensions, showing that the Vatican remains an active moral voice. These examples illustrate a consistent pattern: papal interventions transcend rhetorical condolence. They combine prayer, apology, diplomacy, and moral persuasion to shift the arc of justice. Today, Leo XIV's words about Benue join this historic current, a reminder that the papal office often stands as both conscience and catalyst in global human rights. 8. Implications for Christian-Muslim relations. Across Benue's heartlands today, violence isn't merely rural crime, it's become entangled in the very fabric of interfaith tension. The perpetrators are often Fulani herdsmen, primarily Muslim, while the victims are mostly Christian farming communities. That dynamic risks hardening identities on both sides, setting dangerous tides toward religious polarization. When Pope Leo XIV publicly labeled the Yelwata killings a terrible massacre and specified that it was rural Christian communities who have been victims of incessant violence, he amplified this divide with moral clarity, but also with heavy implications. Though he did not name religious labels, the framing resonates across Nigeria's fragile mosaic. To some Christians, it confirms long-held fears of persecution. To some Muslims, it may raise questions of collective blame, even though most herders are not militants. Yet there lies unexpected potential for bridge building. Pope Leo is no stranger to interreligious outreach. Within weeks of his election, he reached out to the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, signaling a papal commitment to dialogue with Islam, rooted in the legacy of Pope Francis' document on human fraternity. By condemning brutality without condemning an entire faith, Leo's language walks a nuanced line, calling for justice while avoiding blanket indictments. That distinction is critical. It enables Islamic and Christian leaders in Nigeria to step forward together, identifying extremism as the enemy, not Islam or Christianity as the battlefield. But the path won't be easy. Local church leaders, like Bishop Wilfred Anagbi of Makurdi, have testified before international bodies that actors are driven not only by land disputes, but by an Islamic agenda to homogenize Nigeria, backed by extremist ideology. Meanwhile, Fulani communities emphasize historic grazing rights and accuse farmers of encroachment, echoing old grievances. Amid this volatile mix, Pope Leo's appeal becomes a test of interfaith maturity. Can faith leaders and communities resist sectarian drift and instead foster healing? His prayer for security, justice, and peace invites both Muslims and Christians to hold one another accountable, without alienation. For Nigeria's religious leadership, the message must be stand against cruelty, affirm shared humanity, and bridge historic divides. If Pope Leo's interfaith gestures, both spiritual and symbolic, bear fruit, this tragedy may yet ignite a deeper, faith-powered collaboration, one where dialogue, reparations, and joint prayer reclaim Benue's future. 9. Prospects for justice and reconciliation. In the wake of Pope Leo XIV's emphatic call for security, justice, and peace, attention now turns to what concrete actions could follow. Faith-led calls often serve as catalysts. This one could drive deeper investigations, assert federal accountability, and start the long path to reconciliation in Benue State. Nigeria's president, hearing both the papal prayer and rising public outcry, has already ordered top security chiefs to pursue the perpetrators, arresting suspects and promising prosecution. the deployment of special forces, military intelligence, and a directive to state governors signals a shift from passive observation to active enforcement, but credible investigations must follow for those detained. Equally significant is the political dimension. Governor Leo of Benue has been urged to convene reconciliation dialogues between farmers and herders, a critical first step toward community-level trust and avoiding revenge cycles. If shepherded well, these forums could offer truth-telling, victim compensation, and local peace agreements anchored in Christian and Islamic traditions. Contributing to momentum is amplified moral pressure from the Vatican. When the Pope prays publicly and places the massacre in a global moral frame, alongside conflicts in Ukraine and Sudan, the Vatican indirectly supports civil society groups pushing for justice in Nigeria. Catholic missions and NGOs in Benue can use this leverage to pressure local prosecutors and legal authorities to act without fear or favor. Still, challenges loom. Nigeria's history of weak prosecutions and impunity cannot be ignored. Without robust forensic evidence, witness protection, and transparent court processes, arrests risk symbolic value without substantive justice. Observers warn the Pope's words must be matched by institutional rigor, police reform, strengthened legal frameworks, and empowered local courts. Looking ahead, the spark of hope lies in coupling judicial inquiry with restorative roots. Church-centered initiatives, memorial services, counseling for survivors, interfaith prayer vigils, can foster healing alongside legal accountability. The Pope's language encourages this dual pursuit, justice as a right, reconciliation as a moral necessity. In this unfolding chapter, the key question is whether global prayer, political will, and community resolve will converge into lasting peace. If they do, Yelwata's tragedy may serve as a painful beginning, not an ignominious end, to a renewed era of justice and unity in Benue. 10. Role of media and faith communities. In moments like the Yelwata massacre, the story must reach beyond the headlines, and faith-led media and Catholic missions are uniquely positioned to amplify both the truth and the call to action. Nigeria's Catholic television, radio networks, diocesan bulletins, and global Christian NGOs can turn local tragedy into global awareness, ensuring no victim is forgotten and no cry goes unheard. First, Catholic media outlets like Nigeria's Catholic television, CTV, can broadcast survivor testimonies, pastoral appeals, and urgent calls for prayers and support. With existing platforms like A Light for the Nation and Faith in Action, they can reach millions, fostering solidarity and mobilizing grassroots prayer chains, even in remote parishes. Local Catholic missions on the ground are already doing critical work, sheltering survivors, distributing food and medicine, and documenting atrocities. Their first-hand reports fuel international NGOs. Aid to the Church in Need, Save the Persecuted Christians, Caritas, to launch advocacy campaigns, lobby governments, and channel humanitarian aid back to Benue. Global Christian NGOs can further amplify through their networks, publishing impact videos, survivor interviews, and calls to action. These narratives shape the conversation at the United Nations, EU briefings, and press forums, pressuring Nigerian authorities with international visibility and credibility. Digital platforms also play a critical role. Social media channels run by bishops, clergy, and Catholic laity can share live updates, fundraising links, and petition drives. Online prayer vigils or YouTube tributes for the Yelwata victims can build solidarity between African churches and diaspora congregations, turning tragedy into unity. Faith communities in Europe, North America, and Africa can harness sermons, intercession services, and mission partnerships to support Benue's most affected. The Catholic Bishops' Conference, already condemning barbaric massacres, can call for global weekend prayer vigils and partner with local NGOs to fund trauma counseling and medical relief. When faith-led media, Catholic missions, and Christian NGOs join hands, sharing stories, mobilizing aid, and shining moral light, the result goes beyond awareness. It becomes a movement, prayers rising in solidarity, resources flowing for relief, and global Christian conscience turned into sustained support for justice and reconciliation in Benue. Pope Leo XIV's powerful condemnation of Benue's massacre isn't just a headline, it's a moral beacon in a time of darkness. Through his prayer, he demands more than divine mercy, he demands justice, solidarity, an action from Nigeria's leaders, from the global church, from each faithful. As we keep our eyes on Nigeria, let's hold hope to the light of faith. Subscribe for full coverage, expert insight, and stories that matter to Christians worldwide.